Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of History with Tony. We are discussing the American Civil War. Just talking to Brittany, our facilitator, and I grew up from 2, 3 miles from Wilson's Creek National Battlefield, so I've been part of the Civil War for a long time. We are in the first year of the Civil War in 1861. So let's kind of see what we talked about last week. Last week, we looked at the first real large scale battle of the Civil War, the first Battle of Bull Run, also called Manassas. Remember, I told you, if you're with me last week, that the Civil War battles often have two different names. The Union often called them by uh, the largest body of water, like a river or something like that, whereas the Confederacy usually called the battles by the largest physical landmark, like a village or a town or a church or something. So Bull Run is what the Union side called it, and Manassas, after Manassas Junction, was what the Southern side called it. It was only located about 30 miles west of Washington, D.C. We reviewed, first of all, the life of the Union general, a man by the name of Irwin McDowell, who Lincoln had appointed as the first field commander of the Army. Remember, Winfield Scott was the head of the Army, but he was 74 years old. He was ill. He was very obese. He was not a field commander anymore. He was a legend, but he could not take the field anymore. So he appointed Irwin McDowell, which in retrospect was not one of Lincoln's better decisions because McDowell really wasn't prepared to do battle. Now, in his all fairness to him, remember we talked about how McDowell tried to talk Lincoln out of attacking the Confederates at Bull Run because he said, "My troops are too green. They're raw. They're not ready." But Lincoln insisted that he do it, so he did. Turned out to be a disaster. Then we reviewed the life of the Confederate General Joe Johnston, who was one of the co-commanders of the Confederacy troops at Bull Run. The other one was PGT Beauregard, who had been the commanding officer at Fort Sumter. And he was kind of the ongoing, he was the hero of the moment for the Confederacy. So he and Joe Johnston kind of served as the co commanders. Beauregard was really in charge, but actually Johnston outranked him. That's kind of a weird deal. Next, we reviewed McDowell's battle plan, which involved sending General Patterson, who was 69 years old and really had no business being in the field either, to the Shenandoah Valley to keep Johnson occupied. That's where Johnson was. And so, since Beauregard didn't have as many troops as McDowell, he thought if he sent Patterson there, that he would be able to keep McDowell or Johnson from reinforcing Beauregard. It didn't work out that way because Patterson was, I guess you could say, was just incompetent because he let Johnson sneak out of the Shenandoah Valley unbeknownst to him. And even when he found out he was out, he didn't really uh, notify McDowell or Winfield Scott. But Johnson also brought with him a subordinate commander named Thomas Jackson, who is going to play a really big part in the Battle of Bull Run, as well as the rest of the Civil War, at least the first 2 years of it. We saw how McDowell's battle plan worked pretty good. You know, he was flanking Beauregard and Johnson's army, and everything was working real good until Jackson's brigade, the Stonewall Brigade, stood up and just routed the Union near a place called Henry House Hill, pardon me, and end up just absolutely routing the Union Army. We saw how they uh, fled back to Washington, D.C. in a panic. The battle becomes known as the Great Skedaddle in the South. And in the Union, it becomes known as the Picnic Battle because the Northerners were so sure, the civilians and all in Washington were so sure that it was going to be a rout on their part that they actually hopped in buggies and horseback and rode out to the battlefield and packed picnic lunches to watch the Union rout the Confederacy. Didn't work out that way, to say the least. So at that point, that is where we left off last week. So let's see if we can see what happens next. Well, obviously, McDowell did not perform. and in all fairness to him, from what I've been able to read, I'm not for sure it was totally all his fault. Like I said, Lincoln has to share part of the blame because Lincoln pushed him into this battle. Lincoln was doing on the job training. Lincoln was not a military man, and yet he was now the commander in chief. And he made some pretty poor military decisions in the beginning. He learned, and he did very well towards the end, particularly when he found Grant. But in the beginning, he was not a really great commander in terms of making good military decisions. And this was one of the bad ones he made. Well, he removes McDowell. McDowell is obviously, a broken man because he's just lost this battle terribly. And he replaces him with a man by the name of George McClellan. Now, George McClellan, on paper, was the ideal commander. I mean, you could not sit down and make a list of what you would want in a military man and have a better picture of what that person looked like than George McClellan. He had won some small battles already in Western Virginia. He had a reputation as a genius in military theory. He was young. He was just, he had it all. He was handsome. He was popular. He was just really on paper an excellent commander. As we'll see, sometimes paper doesn't always translate to real life. Okay. Well, he brought organization to the Army after the debacle of Bull Run, and he was a great organizer. I mean, that was his strength, was getting an army ready to do battle. It greatly improved their morale. The problem was he was also a narcissist. He had a super ego. And all this adulation that he received because of his spectacular resume went to his head really rapidly. Just look at this. Found himself at odds with General Scott, who he called an imbecile. He got quarreling with the radical Republicans, who were actually the controlling factor in the government now. And they were rabid abolitionists, and McClellan was not an abolitionist in any means at all. He even started calling Lincoln names. Now, he didn't do this in public. He would do it in writings, but it got back to these people. He called Lincoln the original guerrilla, nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. You're not exactly what the thing to do to call your commanding officer, the president of the United States, if you want to get along with him. But that's what he did. His ego was just overwhelming. Okay. But the next 6 months, McClellan goes about his job. He's training, he's enlarging his new Army of the Potomac, it was called. He had, by the end of the 6 months, 160,000 soldiers, the largest army by far and away ever to be on the field in America. He put on a grand review for the elite of Washington. He marched all his shoulders down Pennsylvania Avenue, and it was just spectacular, All the while, he was said to be preparing his grand battle strategy. And he was a fan of Napoleon, who was still considered at this point in time in history the smartest man that had ever commanded an army. And he had studied Napoleon in depth at West Point. And so he was having his grand battle strategy. He was planning it on paper. The problem was his paper strategy never really translated well to the field. On top of that, he was always making excuses when things didn't work out right. Normally, it was because he was outnumbered, which is ridiculous because his army was like 2 and 3 times larger than some of the Southern armies he fought, and yet he was not able to defeat them. He claimed his troops weren't ready for combat, even though he had had them for 6 months training them. It finally got to the point that Winfield Scott, the old legend of the military, was so disillusioned with McClellan and his backbiting and his excuse making that he said, "I've had enough. I don't have to put up with this anymore. I'm 74 years old. I've been a general for 47 years. I've been in the Army for 54 years. I don't need this." And he resigned and went back to West Point, lived in an apartment till he died about 5 years later. So Winfield Scott, the head of the Army, leaves. Well, at that point, Lincoln has no choice but to appoint McClellan as not only the head of the Army of the Potomac, but the general in chief. In other words, he's now in charge of the whole Union Army, besides the Army of the Potomac. And I write here, I said, in hindsight, that proved to be a terrible decision. It was probably his worst single decision that he made as president as far as the military. It was not a good decision on his part. Well, let's look a little bit more about this George McClellan. You can see his picture there. Handsome man. He was in his 30s. He was the son of a prominent Philadelphia physician. He was wealthy. He had already had 2 years of college, believe it or not, when he was accepted into West Point at the age of 15. That shows you how brilliant this guy was. He was incredibly smart. Graduated second in his class at West Point, which is, folks, that West Point even then was a very difficult institution, not let alone now. He was handsome. He was gifted mentally. He was popular. He had charisma. He had sat at the feet of Dennis Hart Mahan, the father of modern military strategy. The guy had it all. I mean, like I said before, you could not draw up a picture of a commander of the Army and draw a better picture than you could George Brenton McClellan. He was just that good on paper. He had served in the Mexican War, although he really never had that much combat. He got malaria and he missed out on a lot of the combat. But his experiences there really did shape the way he thought about fighting a battle and fighting wars. He was a student of flanking maneuvers. He was a student of siege operations. He wasn't really a champion of frontal assaults. He didn't think that was a good way to go, and that's understandable. As a staff officer, he was also able to observe Scott because he worked under General Scott there, how Scott handled the political and the military affairs, how they balanced. And you know that military officers of a high rank have to be politicians as well as they do military officers. 1855, he was so respected as a young man in his 20s still that he was selected to go to Europe to observe the Crimean War, which was a big war going on in the 1850s in Europe. And his observations were so important that he came back and he wrote a whole bunch of military manuals on strategy and tactics, which are still being used, I understand. And if that wasn't enough, he even ended up, inventing a whole new kind of saddle. It's called a McClellan saddle, which is still used in ceremonies today and is still popular all across the nation with those who ride horses. Let me give you an example of his ego. This is from a letter that he wrote to his wife in 1861, where he's describing his position in Washington at the time he was appointed commander in chief, as well as, commander of the Army, as well as the Army of the Potomac. I find myself in a new and strange position here. President, Captain, General Scott, all deferring to me by some strange operation of magic. I seem to have become the power of the land. I almost think that were I to win some small success now, I could become dictator or anything else that might please me. But nothing of that kind would please me. Therefore, I won't be dictator. Admiral self-denial. You can see just he's brimming with narcissism. I mean, he just absolutely thinks that he is so powerful at this point that he could be the dictator. He says, oh, I wouldn't do that. But you can see the thought is there in his mind. That's how big his ego was. If you want to read a great book about George McClellan, and I read this about a year ago, George McClellan, The Young Napoleon by Stephen Sears. He's written several books on the Civil War about different people, and this is just an excellent book. By the way, that is a photograph of the McClellan saddle. My first cousin, who was a horseman, had a McClellan saddle, and I can remember seeing it sitting in his tack room of his barn several times. I never was a horse rider, so I didn't get into that. So I was a city boy, not a farm boy, and but I remember seeing the McClellan saddle, and I actually knew what it was, believe it or not. Okay, so what is going on now? between the Battle of Bull Run and the rest of 1861? Well, there's only one more big battle in 1861 because both sides at this point are so, uh, I'd say, shocked at the enormity of the Battle of Bull Run, and that they realize this is going to be a long fought out war, and they're not either one of them really too hot about engaging in battle. So as a result, there's only one real big battle left in 1861. That's the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Springfield, Missouri. It was the second major battle of the Civil War, but that would be that we're talking about July. That would be August 10th. So it would be about a month and a half away. So what was going on in Washington, D.C., while they were preparing to do great battle for the rest of the war? Well, one of the first things they did was realize that they needed to fortify the capital. Um, it's not that there weren't fortifications in Washington, D.C., but nobody had dreamed that this was going to happen. And this big battle, remember, folks, only occurred 30 miles from the nation's capital. Had Johnston and Jackson and Beauregard had a mind to, they probably could have seized Washington, D.C. after the Battle of Bull Run. They didn't want to either because they said they were exhausted, tired, their troops weren't ready. But they very well have, if they would have chased this panicked mob that was the Union Army back to Washington, D.C., they may well have seized the capital of the United States. And I can't even imagine what that would have occurred if what would have occurred as a result of that. I mean, that would have been a huge step right at the beginning of the war. So while McClellan was whipping the Union Army into shape, and like I said, he was a master at this, Washington, D.C. was undergoing what I like to call fortification facelift. They absolutely just went all out to fortify the nation's capital. Because remember, they're basically surrounded. They're surrounded by Virginia on one side, and Maryland, although it's a border state and never seceded, is also a slave state and had a huge population that was sympathetic to the South. So they're basically surrounded, the nation's capital is, by Southern sympathizers in the South. And so they set out to just really fortify the capital city. By the end of the war, it is one of the most fortified cities in the world. The man in charge of that was a man by the name of John Bernard. He was placed in charge of constructing these fortifications, and he developed a huge line of interconnected forts, every 800 to 1,000 yards. They were all connected by trenches, manned with troops. They had batteries of artillery in different places. And I show you a battery there that is a scene from one of the artillery batteries that were, in place in Washington. They had bridges and they sealed those off. This is one of the earlier bridges that was sealed off. They would man these and fortify them where, again, Washington, D.C. is basically surrounded by water. And so they wanted to make sure that if you cannot get into Washington, D.C. unless you went across one of these bridges, and then these were manned with forts. So in other words, folks, it was almost like an impregnable fortress, pardon me, fortress by the time at the end of the war. So this was one of the biggest things that they did in the first 6 months. Another event that was occurring was the fact that as these states were trying to figure out whether to secede, they were attempting, the Union was at least, to keep certain states from seceding, like Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and parts of Virginia. So let's look at that, because this is where West Virginia is created during the Civil War, if you don't know. This is an original map of Virginia. You can see it includes the state of West Virginia today. So this was the state of Virginia at the beginning of the war. What happened was this. There were lots of different things going on. There was a passage of something called the Corwin Amendment and the Johnson-Crittenden Resolution, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But right now, we're going to talk about the creation of West Virginia. When Virginia voted to secede, the northwestern counties, those 50 counties in gold or yellow there, were basically pro-union, and there weren't a lot of votes at the convention to secede from this northwestern part of Virginia. And so they decided, these 50 counties decided, we're going to have our own vote. And so in April of 1861, they had a second convention after Virginia had seceded. And in that convention at Wheeling, they overwhelmingly voted to stay within the Union. Of the 50 counties, there were 8,408 votes cast, and only 781 of them voted to secede to the Confederacy. Overwhelmingly, this part of Virginia was pro-Union. So, in a sense, they seceded from Virginia, and it took 2 years, but they would eventually become their own state, the state of West Virginia, which is kind of ironic because the whole reason for fighting the Civil War, at least in the minds of most of the Northerners in the beginning, was to make sure that secession didn't happen. They believed that secession was illegal, and yet West Virginia, in a sense, secedes from their part of the state, and the Congress passed it. But that's the way things work in this world. Well, I mentioned that there were other political decisions being made in an attempt to stop the Civil War. Now, the first one actually occurred before the firing on Fort Sumter, and that was something called the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment was passed in the House and the Senate on March 4th, 1861. That is the day before Lincoln is inaugurated as President of the United States. It is a little over a month before the firing on Fort Sumter. So they passed an amendment designed to protect slavery from federal power in hopes of stopping what they saw as an impending civil war. Now, as it turns out, it did not receive sufficient votes to be ratified by the states of the Union. Remember, for an amendment to be ratified, it has to have 3/4 of state legislatures to amend it, to ratify it. And there was no way that they were going to get 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify this. So this was kind of a carrot to this Confederacy. They were saying, hey, guys, we're not, don't secede. You don't need to do this because we are going to protect slavery. This was the attitude. Remember, we get this impression that in the beginning of the Civil War, the whole Civil War was being fought right at the beginning to free the slaves. And while there were lots of people in the North that wanted to free the slaves, that was not in the beginning the overall reason that the Civil War was being fought. Lincoln often said, if I could preserve the Union by freeing every slave, I would. If I could preserve the Union by not freeing any slave, I would. He absolutely, kind of set the tone for the ideas of the nation in the North. It was proposed by a man named Thomas Corwin, representative from Ohio, and the amendment read, no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. Notice they don't say anything about slaves. The word slavery is not in the Constitution. Remember, if you were with me when we talked about the Constitution, I said John Quincy Adams said it was a fig leaf that covered the misgivings of the Union, the Constitution, because they didn't want to mention the word slavery. They knew it was wrong. They just didn't want to talk about it. Okay. By the way, interesting fact about the Corwin Amendment: it is still on the books. Most amendments today have what's called sunset clauses. In other words, you have a certain period of time to vote for them, and if they don't get voted on in that period of time, they're invalid. The Corwin Amendment did not have a sunset clause, so theoretically, if enough state legislatures wanted to, they could vote to basically pass this amendment. Now, obviously, that is not going to happen. I mean, that is absolutely not going to take place. But it's an interesting fact that it's still out there on the books that, there was basically this amendment out there that's still uh, there that basically would protect slavery. It's not going to happen, but it's interesting that it's even there. The second attempt to kind of placate the South occurred after the disaster of Bull Run. 4 days later, the Johnson Crittenden Resolution was passed, sometimes called the Four Aims Resolution. And again, this is not unusual. When America goes to war, there's usually a resolution passed uh, because wars are very seldom, uh, declared now. We just go to war through the president. Uh, we just saw that happen just a few days ago. Uh, in the Johnson Crittenden resolution basically said, these are what our aims are. Look at what the aims was. Uh, they were written up by a man by the name of John Crittenden and Senator Andrew Johnson, who later on became president of the United States, with Lincoln's second vice president. Essentially, it was a conciliatory message to the slave and border states, assuring them that the war effort was not aimed at interfering with their rights to slavery, but rather towards restoring the Union. Folks, that again, I have to tell you, and I don't mean to be beating a dead horse, but in the beginning of the Civil War, the aim for fighting that war was not to end slavery, it was to preserve the Union. Now, eventually it becomes about ending slavery, and rightfully so. But in the beginning, that was not the attitude that most people in the North had. They had to come to that, and they did come to it. Uh, the resolution initially passed Congress almost unanimously. But then in December, they tried to reaffirm it because so many people, once they realized what they had done, they said, hey, we don't like this. You're basically sending a message to the South that we'll let you keep your slaves. And there was enough people, particularly the radical Republicans, who had now under control a man by the name of Thaddeus Stevens. We'll see more about Thaddeus Stevens later if you stay with me. That the radical Republicans, as well as President Lincoln, opposed it. Now, Lincoln didn't oppose it necessarily because he wanted to free the slaves. He opposed it for the following reasons. Number one, he was really concerned about the border states. We've talked about this. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland. These are all the border states between the Confederacy and Union, and he wanted to keep them in the Union. And he was scared that if you went right after slavery in the beginning, that these border states would secede, and they probably would have. Okay, he was not stupid about that. They probably would have. He may not have been a very good military leader in the beginning, but he was a terrific politician, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He also felt that it contradicted his long-held stance against expansion of slavery. He was personally opposed to slavery, but he was willing to put up with it where it was. He just was not going to let it be expanded because he thought it would wither away. He, like a lot of other people from the very beginning, thought if people would give up on slavery of their own accord, that probably wasn't going to happen, but he was hoping it would. Thirdly, he went against it because there was a legal argument in his mind, a constitutional argument that the Union was unbreakable and secession was constitutionally illegal. He said, you cannot secede from the Union. It is a permanent relationship, and there is no breaking that bond of union. And you are traitors by withdrawing from the Union. And so, that was the reason that he would not go along with the Johnson Crittenden resolution. And because of his opposition, as well as the radical Republicans, when it came up for a reaffirmation vote 6 months later, they said, no way, we're not doing it. By the way, the Johnson Crittenden resolution and the Corwin amendments are sometimes kind of confused. A lot of people get them mixed up. So let's look at a short film here, and then I'm going to stop for today, okay? We're going to have kind of a short day today. This is a film from the American Battlefield Trust again that we've been looking at. And this one basically it's basically on how the military is organized. We're going to use terms like brigades, companies, regiments, divisions, corps, and I'm not a military man. I was never in the military, and so this was this is all kind of foreign to me. So I suspect it's kind of foreign to some of you. May not be, but I suspect it probably is. So let's look at this: how the armies are organized during the Civil War and later.
When you signed up to be a Civil War soldier, typically in your town or in a city near your town, you're going to go ahead and join a company. That company of maybe in concept 100 men, but more close to 30 to 50 men in a lot of cases, will eventually be commissioned into a regiment of 10 companies typically. Those 10 companies make up a regiment, and we're standing in a regimental monument here. The numbers of men in a regiment changed a lot throughout the war, but in the middle of the war you could assume a regiment has about 300 men from the same town or county or state or part of a state. A regiment is typically commanded by a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, and those regiments are usually put together into things called brigades. The brigade is, in my opinion, the standard fighting unit of the Civil War. Battles, in my opinion, are fought by brigades. If you want to understand a battle, understand what the brigades did, and it'll all fall into place. Brigades are typically commanded by, appropriately, a brigadier general. Brigadier, brigade. A brigadier general will command a brigade. Sometimes, if that's not available, a colonel will. Sometimes even a lieutenant colonel, especially as it got later into the war. A brigade will consist of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7 regiments sometimes. But if you typically have 4 or 5 regiments in a brigade, and those regiments each have 300 or 400 guys, you're looking at about 1,500 to 2,000 men in a Civil War brigade. Brigades are grouped into divisions. Typically, Confederates put more brigades into their divisions. Yankees tended to put fewer. So you're often going to have 2 or 3 brigades into a Union division, but you'll typically have 3, 4, or 5 brigades in a Confederate division. Therefore, Confederate divisions are a lot bigger. Divisions are ideally commanded by major generals. Those major generals overseeing the brigadier generals and brigades below them. But both sides varied greatly on this. On the Union side, you're going to regularly have brigadier generals and in a few cases even colonels commanding divisions. On the Confederate side, that's much more rare. In the East and the West, you're usually going to have major generals commanding divisions. And not only major generals that went to a military school, the Virginia Military Institute, West Point when they were back in the North, or of course the Citadel. So you're going to have a different treatment when it comes to these divisions. Either way, a couple of divisions, 2, 3, or even 4 divisions makes up a corps. Both armies did it that way. A corps is ideally commanded in the South by a lieutenant general, and it usually was indeed, sometimes by major generals. And on the Union side, a corps is usually commanded by a major general, though sometimes brigadier generals did it as well. These corps will then be grouped 1, 2, or 3, or sometimes even 4, or 5, or 6, or 7 into an army. So in summary, both armies, both the infantry and the cavalry, are organized into companies, into regiments, into brigades, into divisions, into corps, and into armies. Memorize that and you'll understand the Civil War just a little bit better. The artillery is organized differently from the infantry and the cavalry. The artillery is, of course, cannon-based, and one cannon is called a piece. And if you put 2 cannons together, you get a section, okay? That section is typically commanded by a lieutenant. And if you put a couple of sections together, 2 or 3, you actually have a battery. A battery in the South is 4 cannons on average, and in the North, it's about 6 cannons on average, although both sides changed in that respect. And that battery on both sides is ideally commanded by a captain, but often commanded by a lieutenant as well. A battery might have had about 120 to 150 soldiers in it. These batteries could be attached throughout the Army, throughout the war, in different ways. But either way, as the war went on, both sides came up with a system where they could group batteries together. The South eventually would group batteries by battalions, and the Yankees would group batteries by brigades. Not a whole lot of difference between them. The Confederate battalions tended to be bigger than the Union brigades. What's more important is how they were attached, and ultimately both sides realized that early in the war, when they had individual batteries and battalions attached to specific infantry units, it wasn't working because you could be in a tight spot and not have all the artillery you needed. So both sides developed a huge artillery reserve where they would have a certain number of battalions and brigades of artillery that the Army commander, that the chief of artillery could command and get into the right part of the battle at the right time.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. I really encourage you, if you're really interested in the Civil War, to look at some of these short films on the internet. It's from the American Battlefield Trust. It's called The Civil War in 4 Minutes, and they are just terrific little films. And if you're like me, your attention span is kind of short sometimes, so they're about the right length. Okay, you can lose contact after about 4 or 5 minutes. I'm sure that's why they're that way. Well, I enjoyed talking to you today. Remember, I will not be here next week. I'm going to be gone for the day, and so you're going to have a day off. But we will come back, and 2 weeks from now, we're going to be talking about the Civil War in the Western Theater, particularly the Battle of Wilson's Creek, which was very near to where I grew up. So I hope you enjoyed this today. I hope you've learned something. And I always encourage you to become lifelong learners and stay with us, because that's the key to keeping young, I think. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.